In the final days of World War II, the Battle of Berlin marked the climactic end to the Nazi regime and the European theater of the war. Fought between April and May 1945, this brutal and desperate confrontation saw the Soviet Union's Red Army encircle and capture the German capital. As the last major offensive of the European conflict, the Battle of Berlin signaled not only the defeat of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, but also the immense toll the war had taken on Europe. This is the story of the Battle of Berlin, the prelude to the battle. By early 1945, the Axis powers were in retreat on all fronts. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine River and were advancing into Germany from the west, while the Soviet forces were rapidly pushing in from the east after a series of successful operations. The German military, once feared across Europe, was now crumbling under the relentless pressure of the Allied advance. Morale among the German troops was at an all-time low, and the civilian population was increasingly aware that defeat was inevitable. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, was determined to capture Berlin before the Western Allies could reach the city. Stalin saw the capture of Berlin not only as a strategic military objective, but also as a symbol of Soviet dominance in the post-war order. The Red Army, commanded by Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, was tasked with delivering the final blow to Nazi Germany. Stalin ordered his generals to race to Berlin, setting the stage for one of the most intense urban battles in history. The German defense of Berlin was overseen by General Helmuth Weidling, who faced the impossible task of defending the city with a ragtag force of regular army units, Waffen-SS troops, and a mix of poorly armed Volkssturm, People's Militia, and Hitler Youth members. Despite the dire situation, Adolf Hitler refused to flee the city, instead choosing to remain in his underground bunker, where he would direct the final doomed defense of his regime. The Soviet advance on Berlin. The Soviet offensive to capture Berlin began on April 16, 1945. Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front launched a massive assault on the Silo Heights, a heavily fortified position east of Berlin. The battle for the Silo Heights was one of the most intense and costly engagements of the Eastern Front. The Germans, using the high ground and prepared defenses to their advantage, inflicted heavy casualties on the Soviets. However, the sheer weight of Soviet numbers and firepower eventually overwhelmed the defenders, and by April 19th, the Silo Heights had fallen. Simultaneously, Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front was advancing on Berlin from the south, while the Second Belarusian Front, commanded by Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, moved in from the north. The encirclement of Berlin was completed within days, cutting off the city from any potential reinforcements. The Soviets had effectively trapped the German forces within Berlin, sealing their fate. As the Soviets closed in on the city, the scale of destruction intensified. Artillery bombardments reduced entire districts of Berlin to rubble, and the streets were filled with the sounds of battle, explosions, gunfire, and the screams of the wounded. Civilians caught in the crossfire sought shelter wherever they could, often huddling in basements or underground bunkers as the fighting raged above them. The fall of Berlin. The Soviet assault on Berlin itself began on April 21, 1945. The Red Army, advancing from all directions, methodically pushed through the outer districts of the city. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, with every street, building, and room turning into a battlefield. German defenders, though vastly outnumbered, fought with a desperate resolve, knowing that surrender would mean the end of everything they had known. In the final days of the battle, the fighting moved closer to the center of Berlin. The Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Nazi Germany, became a primary target for the Soviets. On April 30th, after intense close-quarters combat, Soviet troops raised their flag over the Reichstag, signaling the imminent fall of the city. This moment was immortalized in the famous photograph of the Red Army soldier hoisting the Soviet flag over the ruins of Berlin, a symbol of the Soviet victory and the fall of the Third Reich. As the Soviets advanced, Hitler's situation grew increasingly dire. On April 30th, 1945, in his underground bunker beneath the Chancellery, Adolf Hitler committed suicide alongside his wife, Eva Braun. His death marked the end of the Nazi regime's leadership. Following Hitler's suicide, his chosen successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, attempted to negotiate a partial surrender with the Western Allies, but the Soviets pressed on, determined to capture the city. On May 2, 1945, General Weidling, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, surrendered Berlin to the Soviets. The city lay in ruins, with tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians dead. The Battle of Berlin had ended, but at an immense cost: the aftermath and impact. The fall of Berlin was a decisive moment in the history of World War II. The city, once the capital of Nazi Germany, was now a devastated landscape of rubble and despair. The victory in Berlin came at a staggering human cost, both for the defenders and the attackers. The exact number of casualties is still debated, but estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives during the battle. The capture of Berlin signaled the complete and final defeat of Nazi Germany. Just days after the city's fall, on May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies, bringing an end to the war in Europe. The war's conclusion led to the division of Germany into occupation zones controlled by the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, a division that would eventually solidify into the separate states of East and West Germany during the Cold War. The Battle of Berlin also marked the beginning of a new era in European history. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a superpower, having played a crucial role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. However, the war had left Europe deeply scarred, with millions dead and vast swathes of the continent in ruins. The political landscape of Europe was irrevocably altered, leading to the onset of the Cold War and the division of Europe into Eastern and Western blocs. Conclusion. The Battle of Berlin was the final tragic act of World War II in Europe. It was a battle fought with unparalleled ferocity, where the defenders knew that defeat was inevitable, yet fought on in a desperate bid to delay the end. For the Soviet Union, it was the culmination of years of brutal conflict on the Eastern Front, a victory that came at an enormous cost. As we remember the Battle of Berlin, we must reflect on the immense human suffering that it entailed and the consequences it had for the post-war world. The fall of Berlin was not just the end of a battle. It was the end of an era. The ruins of the city stood as a stark reminder of the devastation that war can bring and of the resilience of those who endured it. The legacy of the Battle of Berlin is a testament to the horrors of war and the unyielding spirit of those who fought to survive.